I would say the only answer is to build more social houses, and then to build more social houses, and then maybe to build more social houses.
Hello, and welcome to today's edition of Scottish Tenants News. I'm here with Carmen and Fiona to discuss the STO in the media. And first off, we have the eviction ban. We have the eviction ban has failed, and we have been trying to highlight that in the news. There are record numbers of eviction hearings taking place just now, so I wonder if you maybe wanted to comment on that, Fiona.
Yep. An eviction ban came into effect during COVID, and it was absolutely the right thing to do at the time. Protections for tenants to this extent should have been in place years ago. It should have always been the case that people had enough time and access to enough knowledge and support to fight evictions. I've been unfairly evicted before because my landlord knew they could get more money for the property. It become worth more, it become trendier while I lived in the area, which people like Partick in Glasgow, for instance, are experiencing at the moment. Very sharp increases in rent, and landlords wanting them out so they can increase the rent and get new people in to pay it. I think part of the record numbers of these cases going to tribunal right now will be because there's quite a backlog from COVID. And I think a lot of landlords are now in a position where they can go through the process and they've wanted to be carrying out evictions for a long time. So I think that accounts for part of it. But as I say, I really think that the evictions process needs to be scrutinised better by the government. I think there should be less legitimate reasons why a landlord can ask a tenant to leave, and that tenants should have a dedicated support service in place. I mean, citizens' advice is excellent. There are lots of advice services that are brilliant, but I really do think the Scottish Government should have an advice service in place to provide for the support needs of people who are facing evictions, many of them who are facing unfair evictions.
And of course, Carmen, 100 of these cases are from social landlords. So social landlords were exempt from a lot of the restrictions that were brought in to clamp down on the racketeering in the private renting sector. I wonder if you maybe have a think about that. What's your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's kind of news to me, to be honest. I think it seems a bit crazy though, because if social housing is supposed to be much more secure tenancies, aren't they? So where do you go if you're being evicted by a social landlord? You know, what's the safety net then? You know, it's homelessness, isn't it? So, you know, I think that it's very barbaric, and I think sometimes these things get kind of clouded in this like official language, which can hide, you know, just how violent it is to I read something recently that I thought was very true. You know, your right to so it was towards landlords saying, you know, your right to get income is never more than someone's right to have a home. And I thought that's absolutely true, because people, we need homes. We need somewhere safe, secure to live. Everyone needs that, and so if that's not being provided by social housing, then that's a massive. I don't know where you go from that. How do you kind of fight back against that?
The ban was only up to a certain financial ceiling. I think it was just over £2,000. So if you amassed more debts than that, and in many cases we're talking about people who the benefits have been messed up by the DWP. So. They're finding themselves caught out. So obviously the eviction ban not really working, unfortunately, because we have record numbers. But on to the positive, there was a major victory for tenants in that the Glasgow Housing Organisation, the Glasgow Housing Association, the Wheatley Group, they anticipated a rent rise of 6.1%, but actually the tenants beat them in the ballot. What do you think about that?
I'm really pleased about that. I think whenever people are duly consulted, which is an increasing rarity in our world with consultations, I would consider nothing short of sham consultations. I think very often an organisation that is consulting won't really announce that they're consulting. The people who they're supposed to be aiming the consultation at don't have access to it or don't know about it. It might be digital, and yet their demographic doesn't have access to the internet. They don't know the deadline for involving themselves in the consultation. So I'm actually really pleased that tenant power has prevailed and that people have been organised, informed, and they've known how to engage and been given the opportunity to engage. So that's a massive win for tenant organisation.
Yeah, of course. And at the same time, we see landlords in North Glasgow pursuing the highest rent rises in the country. So it's kind of compare and contrast. Weekly tenants have been a bit more organised, but tenants in Queen's Cross and Maryhill Housing and others are looking at 7%. What do you think, Carmen?
Yeah, I mean, I think I read a couple of articles about that, and it was quite interesting. There was this kind of almost threat that if we don't raise the rents by this much, the services will suffer. But I think situation that you have with a lot of social landlords at the moment is actually the services are already quite poor. And I think that's much more systemic, and it's much more to do with, this is, talking about, reverting back to Wheatley, but in the Wynford there's been a lot of complaints about, people being billed for, repairs and things that were carried out in a way that weren't, they weren't effective repairs, but there were huge bills coming in. They had to maybe call out, for example, roof repairs, over and over again, to have them keep happening and keep being ineffective. So I think we need to kind of question this kind of idea that the services are, that you can't have good services and basically protect people, in a cost of living crisis who can't afford these kind of increases. We need to have a high level of services and repairs, and we have to find a way, to make it work, and housing associations have to find a way to make it work, without putting, raising bills that people just can't pay them. So,
Yeah, and I guess the flip side of that evictions story, the rise in evictions, is that there is a homelessness crisis, and it's the worst since the advent of the Scottish Parliament. The stories that we've led on, hundreds of Scots forced to sleep on the streets, the scandal of 36 homeless deaths in Glasgow hotels, dozens of homeless people died. We held a vigil for the 36 who've died since they brought in the unsuitable accommodation order, which basically says that if you're living more than 7 days in a hotel, the authority, in this case Glasgow City Council, should be brought to book. But the Glasgow City Council have broke that unsuitable accommodation order more than 2,000 times in that time frame, and obviously the deaths of the 36 people are testament to that. These homeless hostels, homeless hotels, actually really, they're not. These aren't hotels that the public stay in. This is a kind of almost like a racket. And there are 3 hotels in Glasgow which are profiteering out of that. But then on the flip side, you've got the 5% rise in the cost of temporary accommodation for homeless people. Those who have to pay, who are not in receipt of benefits. But obviously, if you're homeless, chances are you need a bob or two. So mostly that goes on to people's debts that then get carried on. So what do you reckon, Fiona, about this? Obviously a huge issue right now.
Yep. I think that a lot of it comes down to a fundamental lack of resources. So we have a massive lack of social housing. We know there's been lots of demolitions. There's been lots of decanting people to unsuitable areas, overcrowding, etc. That's driving homelessness, as well as just a lack of suitable accommodation with one needs it. And so we will see people that are in temporary situations more than they ought to be. But that's not the only factor affecting homelessness. And these massive numbers that we shouldn't have of people that are in a homeless situation. We've also got massive funding cuts to social work, massively increasing social workloads. So I actually used to volunteer in one of the previous accommodations that the city had for temporary homelessness, and people were in a sort of rough sleeping situation, or they had nowhere to go for the night. They would be directed by people who are charities mostly who are working on the streets who would direct them where to go, and they would come to us, and they could be very transient, you know, they could be very not able to organise themselves. So in their current situation, having a flat given to them wouldn't be the best thing, but we should have a situation where we've got the right social work, the right mental health support, and that can help people towards accessing accommodation. But even if we did have that, there isn't enough accommodation for people that are in that situation where they're ready to, you know, get settled somewhere. And then you've got crisis situations. There are massive volumes, I don't know the number offhand, maybe we could add into the link afterwards. There's massive numbers of families right now that are in temporary accommodation, and that's a scandal of our time in Glasgow. When you think of homelessness and temporary accommodation, you generally don't think of families, children who are in temporary accommodation, but there are literally hundreds throughout Scotland right now.
We revealed that last month. Again, record numbers.
Yeah. Record
numbers of families. And really, I mean, let's really start the over 2,000 unsuitable accommodation orders. I mean, the Scottish Government brought that regulation in with the idea that people wouldn't languish in hotels for long periods of time. But now, we held the vigil, and it was, you know, we brought our banners along there and lit a candle and said a few words to the media and so on to highlight the issue. But we were joined in our protest by a chap who'd been staying in the hotel in question, and he'd been there 18 months solidly, just without a break. And that clearly is in breach of the regulation, but it seems the regulator's not doing anything. What's your take on this, Carmen?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I just have to kind of echo what's already been said, you know, that it seems like, you know, that it's not set up to answer to what people actually need and people's like specific needs and complex needs. You know, and there's not that kind of, you know, social care, mental health support, you know, and various other things that could be brought in that people actually need. And I think as well, what makes me kind of quite angry about it is feeling that, you know, a lot of people who end up in that situation, they've already been let down, and I think there needs to be much bigger efforts from, you know, our community, well, not just our communities, but our society as a whole, the government, you know, to actually go to much greater lengths to help people who are, you know, kind of just being left in hotels and forgotten about. I think it's and it's tragic as well. And I think, you know, some of the language as well, I find very. I was reading. I read the word regrettable. A council member was saying it was regrettable what happened, these deaths.
These are people's lives.
Yeah, and that, you know, it's very you know, it's regrettable, but was basically what they were saying. And you know, you think there's just this huge kind of disconnect where, you know, people are seen as like kind of, you know, there's nothing more we can do. You know, we've given them a hotel room. That's, you know, but that's ridiculous to assume that would necessarily meet anyone's needs, not especially someone who, you know, had, you know, maybe, you know, difficulty with addiction and the mental health and, you know, various other things. So
well, exactly. I mean, many of these hotels are. I myself, I was homeless once, and I moved into. It's now closed. It was a hotel for the homeless, and the heroin was there openly. I opened my door one time in this hostel to an arterial bleed from someone who'd been injecting into the arteries, and you know, there was a BMW would drive up, and a guy would come out with a paper bag and sell. And that was apparently with a collusion of the hotel. Now, I'm not casting any aspersions on hotel owners, but there are certainly some links between organised crime and many of these hotels. And the fact that the Scottish Government has this, in many ways, progressive policy to stop people languishing in hotels, but there's no enforcement of that. The council can just basically, you know, the largest council in the country can just basically stick two fingers up to the government and get away with it. But it kind of brings us on to the next topic about hotels, because over the weekend there, just last Sunday, we had the regular demonstrations at the Erskine Hotel, which has become flashpoint at Erskine with local people, and it must be said, some fascists organising to see the hotel closed because it's become one of these hotels for Suella Braverman's refugee dispersal policy. And the demonstrations there have said that how can we house these people when we can't house our own people? So the Wynford Residents Union and the Scottish Tenants Organisation attended a counter demonstration saying, well, we have 500 empty flats in the Wynford, 500 empty flats that could help both homeless people languishing in hotels and refugees languishing in hotels. And pointed out, of course, that the Wynford Residents Union had asked Neil Gray, the Refugees Minister, to use the spare flats in the Wynford to accommodate refugees from Ukraine, to stop them living on boats and other substandard accommodation. So I wonder, just continuing there, Carmen, what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes so deeply to the heart of the problem. I think a lot of people understand, even if they are not, struggling to find somewhere to live themselves, they may have kids or brothers or sisters or, who can't find somewhere to live at the moment. And I think there is this kind of understanding that there's a massive shortage. And for a lot of people, the narrative is just, well, it must be because of immigration. And so to get that kind of message out there, I think is really important, that actually this is a constant erosion of social housing in terms of the numbers. With just less and less social housing that we've got, and it's having a huge impact on everyone, really. People who don't necessarily think that it'll affect them, I think it affects us all. And with these flats in the Wynford especially, I think what's really important is to raise these points. We've got these empty flats; they're here right now. The plans for regeneration, a lot of them are very abstract. A lot of the consultation has not been done on concrete plans. So if the flats get knocked down, it's not actually clear what will be built. Wheatley are saying social housing, but Wheatley said Sighthill would be social housing, and it's not. So I think it's really important to take stock of what we've got and protect it, and to fight for it. In terms of these flats, and to fight for them to be I'm a big believer in this, refurbished, retrofitted, and really brought up to a really high standard, as social housing as well, not as private housing, which has happened in other parts, of the country. Obviously, a lot of listed 1960s social housing is being privatised at the moment, and kind of turned into really swanky, really beautiful, flats that people pay millions of pounds in some case for, and so for example, Balfour Tower in London, and you just think that potential is there now, with these flats, to make them really luxurious actually, but as social housing. And I don't think that's, I think that's beyond, in some ways that seems like it's a far-fetched thing to say, that social housing should be luxurious, but I think in terms of space, comfort, health, we actually should be demanding a kind of really high standard of housing for everyone, especially people who've been let down by this, by our society already. I think they should be first in line in terms of getting access to nice, warm, comfortable, safe places to live.
It's interesting, those connections, Fiona. People languishing in hotels for a long time as homeless, and refugees placed in hotels by Suella Braverman, in a sense creating community tensions when that didn't need to happen.
No, it didn't need to happen, and this is just populism. It's always what's used, particularly by Tory governments, when we have a crisis of some kind. And I think it's important to remember that immigrants aren't your problem. A morally bankrupt government is your problem. An incompetent government is your problem. A government that lacks vision, even basic vision, is your problem. I mean, the Tories have built nothing. in Scottish Government we've built very little, and what we have built has been contracted out to other countries. So we're not job creating, we're not home creating, we're just knocking things down and we're not building anything up. I mean, it's not coincidence that we've destroyed hundreds of thousands of social homes in Scotland and we're seeing a massive housing crisis. We've not rebuilt them. I mean, it's a given that we're going to see massive levels of homelessness. Reliance on the few resources we do have, like hotels. But it is going to stoke discontent. It is going to stoke populist views like immigrants are the problem. Immigrants are never the problem. And I think if we spend as much time holding government to account that we do getting invested or pulled into arguments about who's to blame, then we would maybe see a bit of progress. I personally would like to spend more time fighting tax evasion because I know how much money we lose to that. And we could build quite a few social homes if we were to prevent tax evasion from Friends of the Tories.
Well, you touched there on the lack of spending on public housing, but the news this month was that the Scottish Government is cutting the public housing budget by £177 million.
Right. I can't see how that would help the housing scarcity problem. We've got no social housing, we've got reliance on hotels, we've got record levels of people being evicted through the tribunal system right now, overcrowding. In my job as a counsellor, I spend a lot of my time dealing with people in inadequate housing. Mould is a massive problem, and that was also in the news.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to touch on it later.
Yeah. So even people that are in housing, a lot of our housing stock is in dreadful condition. You know, we should be refurbishing, we should be doing repairs, we should be building new housing stock. And that's not an argument to, for instance, knock down several hundred social homes, wherever that might happen. But we should be building new as well as maintaining the stock we do have. Maybe not letting it fall into gross disrepair to the extent where I'm getting emails in my job as a counsellor that a person's doctor is telling me they need a new house or they need this problem fixed, or my son has a terrible lung condition now because he's been breathing this since he was born and now he's 8 years old. My doctor said it's most likely the mould, which I get all the time from medical professionals across the city. So I'm led to believe that the state of our housing is unacceptable and it's a health risk. And also, it's obvious to me that we don't have enough housing, so that would be a really bad area to cut spending in.
Yeah, and of course, Carmen, the Affordable Housing Supply Grant, which is basically the money for public housing, that also funds mid-market rent. And one of the arguments for funding mid-market rent is that per house, mid-market rent is cheaper than building public housing. And therefore, the government can create more affordable housing, more bang per buck, if you like, for less money. If it goes down the mid-market rent route. Do you think that £177 million cut is likely to see the Scottish Government pursue more mid-market rent, which, you know, as we see, has had some quite deleterious effects in places like the Wynford?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just sounds like the latest reason in a long trajectory of the trend, which is, you know, to move towards higher rents and, you know, the privatisation of public housing. So, you know, I think, yeah, I mean, the problem is, I mean, when we talk about, you know, what is affordable housing, you know, I think we have to remember that, you know, there are places in the world where, you know, social housing is the norm, and most people live in social housing, including, you know, people, you know, not just on low incomes, but people on kind of a wide range of incomes and what.
Indeed, it used to be the norm in Scotland.
It used to be the norm, yeah.
In the
exactly.
1970s, 70% of people lived in public housing.
Yeah, which is, you know, remarkable compared to today. I mean, what was it, like 30% or something now? I'm not exactly sure.
It's close to that, yes.
Yeah, so, you know, that obviously changes, you know, huge kind of demographic shift in terms of that. But I think as well, you know, that there's this kind of myth that private housing is going to be, you're going to get more better services, more responsive kind of landlords, and I think that's just we're seeing now that that's just absolutely not the case. In terms of the service that you're provided, I think public housing is the way forward, and you can see that today in terms of when you look at places like Vienna, which is renowned for the high quality of housing, and in fact people have very secure tenancies, so people don't actually have to necessarily. We aspire so much to home ownership in the UK, but if you have a setup or a city where you can have very, very secure tenancies, and you can rent. There's no insecurity in being a renter. It can be you can have 5-year tenancies and you can get really settled, and there's not that kind of same kind of I think one of the reasons why home ownership is and it's unattainable for so many people as well, obviously, but why it's kind of people aspire towards it is it's the only kind of way of getting real security, and I think that's that we need to kind of rethink that and go back to understanding how good kind of social structures can be in terms of providing really good housing for people.
Indeed, I always remember the Scottish Socialist Party's policy where if you'd paid rent for 35 years, I think it was 35 years, might be 33, you can correct me later, but the idea was after you'd paid rent for that period of time, you'd done your bit, and from then on you could live rent free in the property. You couldn't pass it on, you couldn't sell it off, but you were secure for the rest of your tenure, and you had served your debt to society, so to speak. But it kind of touches on a little bit about what comes next, which is this idea of the weekly group targeting the Wynford Residents' Union and targeting its members for standing up for public housing in the Wynford. Obviously 600 socially rented homes threatened with demolition. And the new Wynford Residents' Union chair was contacted by a social worker at the behest of his housing officer, because they wanted to ask if he was vulnerable and had been exploited by the Wynford Residents' Union and opposing the demolition. And of course this fella had been staying in the high flats there for more than 20 years. So they were his home, and obviously he gave the social worker what for. He said, I do feel I'm being exploited. I feel I'm being exploited by the Glasgow Housing Association, who's kicking me out of my home that I've lived in for several decades. And of course not the only example there of tenants in the Wynford standing up for social housing who'd been targeted for a certain amount of harassment. And obviously the Residents' Union there appealing for solidarity from trade unionists, making the point that it had, for example, this fella join Unison or Unite, and his employer had referred him to the social work department saying, are you a vulnerable person because you've fought for a pay rise? Just ludicrous idea, but it shows the power of the institution. I wonder if you maybe want to talk about that, Carmen.
Yeah, I mean it's quite frustrating, really. I mean, I know William. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think this point has been made before, but it's if someone kind of like William joined a trade union, it wouldn't the idea that he would be seen as vulnerable, and that would just be kind of totally crazy, and it should be seen that way. I had a thought when you were talking about it, and I've totally forgotten it, so I'm just trying to remember what I was thinking. But yeah, I mean, do you have anything to say on that one?
Yeah, I know the person that you're talking about, and I wouldn't imagine being able to easily exploit them. I mean, they're not backward in coming forward. So, but yeah, no, I think it's outrageous. I mean, the notion that a person being part of a union and having that solidarity in organisation would make them vulnerable to exploitation is ironic, given that they are trying to protect themselves from exploitation. I mean, that's the reason he's got involved in it, and they must not have watched any of this person's speeches online the past year or so, because he's been very vocal about his experience of feeling exploited and targeted and demeaned and not listened to, and upset for his neighbours that are experiencing the same thing.
And of course, he's now the chairperson.
Yes, he is now the chairperson. Yes, so I think that's maybe just caused him to become more passionate about organisation and standing up for people, feeling duress through the inappropriate involvement of a social worker. And as I said earlier on, our resources are really depleted through budget cuts in this city, and I'm disappointed that would be a use of social worker time when I understand how high desks are stacked with cases. I do really value the work of our social work department, and they're probably quite misled and genuinely concerned. I'm disappointed that any organisation was sought to take up their time on that.
But it does show, it shows the power of the Wheatley Group and being able to use their institutional clout well beyond what's right. But turning in a second to the question of planning and policy, because there's been a lot happening this month on this front. First off, on just at the beginning of the month, Glasgow City Council held a retrofit summit. And I'm sure this is right up your street, Carmen, because they held a retrofit summit, and the key speakers were the council and GHA. And of course, we had Labour MSP Paul Sweeney saying it was somewhat ironic, given the way that they were behaving towards Wynford. What's your thoughts, Carmen?
Yes, I mean, this very frustrating, because I definitely see this as, like, again, part of a trajectory, a theme that has been ongoing, I think, since COP26. It was really highlighted, was just the amount of kind of greenwashing that Glasgow City Council and to be honest, the Scottish Government as well kind of engages in. And I think there's so much irony when you contrast how we are presenting ourselves as a city where supposed to be signed a circular declaration, all about how we're going to keep resources in the kind of supply chain loop, and we're basically going to do all this amazing stuff. We're going to become a zero waste city, and I think this was just another kind of example that Glasgow City Council not enjoying the kind of aesthetic of being a kind of retrofit leader, and taking a lot of credit for the hard work of certain kind of housing. I think some housing associations are doing good work in this regard. Wheatley certainly are not, so I don't quite understand what platform they have to talk on the summit. And I was actually at this retrofit summit as well, and it was really kind of remarkable how little I think what anyone who kind of is interested in retrofit will kind of notice is there's a real kind of justice element, housing justice element to retrofit, because there is so much opportunity to make homes. You talked about kind of mouldy homes, mouldy cold homes, how unhealthy they are, how bad they are for people's health, especially old people, vulnerable people. Retrofit, deep retrofit, high quality retrofit is the opportunity to do right by people in so many different ways. So there's a real kind of strong kind of there's a lot of good reasons to do this stuff, and really I think it's very inspiring, actually, a lot of the projects that are going on in Glasgow and in the rest of the world. But the retrofit summit actually became very kind of boring, because the focus was very much on kind of quite irrelevant data that wasn't really connected to any kind of really bold vision of where housing could go in the next however many years we've got until it's 2045. We're supposed to be net zero by decarbonise our housing stock. So it's a huge challenge, and there wasn't any kind of indication that any of the major players, according to Glasgow City Council or the Scottish Government, are actually going to take this on in any kind of meaningful way. It's very kind of cautious. It's very uninspiring. It's to be honest, boring. And I think that is actually relevant, because if you're talking about like the participation and interest of, if you're trying to get the interest of communities and the participation of communities, it needs to be it needs to be a hopeful, exciting vision of what their housing can be like, you know, and it needs to be, you know, a really kind of interesting, you know, new chapter in our kind of city. So yeah.
And of course, at the summit, there was a question from the floor from someone from the Wynford Residents' Union, and they didn't take the question. They said they didn't have the time.
Yeah, well, they said that it wasn't relevant. So obviously, you know, Wheatley have done massive kind of demolitions, which is in very direct antithesis to you know, retrofit, which is all about you know, improving existing housing stock. You know, and so yeah. So
we'll set the question on the screen, but it was literally, when will you talk to the Wynford Residents' Union about retrofitting the four high-rise blocks?
Yes, it was, yeah, and I think it kind of embarrassed Wheatley a bit, and they didn't engage with it at all, which I was quite surprised at. I thought they would have some sort of reason or some sort of account of why they couldn't retrofit these flats. But I think also because there were so many kind of retrofit experts at that summit, like professionals in the built environment, that I think that the guy probably knew from Wheatley he couldn't get away with saying all the stuff that he says to residents, basically, these are impossible to be made energy efficient. Well, you can't say that as a summit full of kind of tradesmen who work with retrofit, you know, because you know they'll know better. So yeah, so we did, and we managed to it was a very popular question as well. So it went up. There was like a kind of ranking system. It went right up to the top, and they deliberately ignored it. Which was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So.
And on to you, Fiona. They had in the UK Parliament, there's a very controversial piece of legislation called the Levelling Up Bill, and it's fair to say that the Scottish Government says that it conflicts with devolution, and if I can quote Kate Forbes, this is fundamentally at odds with the devolution settlement, which places responsibility for devolved matters with the Scottish Government. So not a fan, Kate Forbes, who may well become First Minister. But the Levelling Up Bill had an amendment in the House of Lords by a Liberal Democrat peer who called for no demolition without planning consent. And it brings into question the process that happened in Wynford with the demolition, what they call it again. You can keep me right here, Carmen. I forget the exact name the term, but apparently you can blow up 600 socially rented homes without planning consent. You just need to go through a certain process.
I can't remember, but yeah. I
So it's but this would correct that injustice in a sense, and allow a bit of democratic oversight of mass housing demolition. So I wonder, perhaps unlikely to make it to the statute book in Scotland given the constitutional dimension. I don't know if you maybe comment on that.
Can you recap the question?
Oh yes, of course. So the Levelling Up Bill, which is a UK Parliament bill from the Tories, basically, it has a range of different effects, and the Scottish Government are dead against it for constitutional reasons. But there was an amendment in the House of Lords from a Liberal Democrat peer calling for no demolition without planning consent. And obviously in the Wynford you had the process where there were 23 objections, which would, if it were a planning decision, that would have sent it to a planning committee and been subject to democratic oversight. But because it is a separate process, it doesn't need planning consent. It can proceed without planning consent. And in terms of mass housing demolition, that obviously has a huge public interest, but apparently if they go down that route, big landlords don't need planning consent to pursue mass housing demolition.
Yeah, I just see that as an attempt to circumvent democracy, and democracy has already been put in place. It's kind of like having a get out of jail card hidden in your pocket when you're playing Monopoly with the kids. It's really sneaky. 23 objections is plenty enough to realise that there's a problem within the community with this decision, especially when it's a decision on such a large scale. I think it's a really vulgar opportunity seized to try and circumvent democracy when it's such a large scale project. You know, it's not 50 houses would be bad enough, 100. We're talking about 600. It's just deeply cynical, and it's kind of like the authorities here have a hand behind their back and you can't see what they've got in it. I'm really disappointed at the way that genuine community engagement has been cut out here, and that rightful processes have been obstructed.
But obviously within the law, and that might change it, although not in Scotland, it must be said. But there was another interesting piece in the same publication, the Architects Journal, a paywalled publication and widely read by architects, but not widely read outside of that. However, it covers a lot of interesting stuff. And a piece out, the architects risk reputational damage, and it called that Russian roulette when it comes to supporting demolition. Now, obviously, Wynford, the demolition has recently been backed by two different architects, Mast Architects and Dr. Richard Atkins, who both weighed in on behalf of Wheatley, the GHA, to call for the demolition. Mast Architects, in fact, taking to the airwaves, not just media releases, but also on the radio, saying that the flats are not fit for human habitation. All this kind of stuff. I want to maybe comment on that, Carmen.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bit of a kind of battle for a narrative happening, where it sounds as if there's like, I mean, for example, I can't remember who it was, but some architect had said in the press that these flats were impossible to insulate. And I think
that was Mr. Richard Atkins, Dr. Richard Atkins.
Right, yeah. So I think, that was, a little bit absurd, to be honest, because they have already been insulated. In fact, they're warmer than most of the flats in Glasgow. And there's absolutely no reason why they can't be kind of better insulated. I mean, I think as well, one of the big kind of things that Wheatley have said is that they're impossible to what they basically kind of characterised, those of us who are quite passionate about this issue and are campaigning on it as kind of these kind of mad activists who just don't have any idea about these buildings. But actually, a lot of us are from a kind of building and construction and architecture background. Well,
indeed. I mean, backed by an OBE and an MBE, these crazed radicals.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I think what we're calling for is actually incredibly kind of quite subdued. Actually, it's we're calling for these houses to be valued for what they are. Especially in the context of a climate crisis and of a acute housing shortage, so I think there are lots of options with these flats, and I think those options in the architecture world, I think there's starting to open up. There's been several projects that have really started to open up people's ideas of what's possible, and actually when attention and creative attention, I guess, money, time, experts, when all that energy goes into like flats like the Wynford, actually there's all this potential that was kind of never really recognised before. So I mean, I've talked a lot about La Vassal in France, in Bordeaux. They did this beautiful retrofit of 3 blocks of flats. But there's other examples. There's one in Sheffield. I'm trying to remember the exact name, but if you look up, I think it's Patton Park or something, and they've turned it into it's brutalist architecture. They've turned it into student flats. They've really kind of done it up, made it very colourful, very very quirky, very beautiful. People, most people I think would see a flat in there and think, "Oh, this is nice. This is exciting." So there's all this potential that is just being kind of shut down before it's even been explored. And I think a lot of the claims about, I mean, of course, if you were to look into these flats and genuinely explore what's possible with them, there would be limitations in terms of what you could do structurally, what you could do. But I don't think Wheatley have actually entered into that process in good faith. And we're not kind of saying, disregard that kind of stuff. You can, it's actually, let's look into it. Let's find out what you can do and what you can't do. Because and also bring the community in, because they might have some really good ideas about what what they want in their neighbourhood, and what what would make that space, not just the flats but the community centre, all the green space around it, all of that area, what could make that work really well for the people who live here, or better than it already does. So yeah, that's.
Well, on the Fiona, I mean, a very similar vein, there was another piece in the same publication, the Architects Journal, talking about a Hippocratic oath for architects, like doctors, do no harm, I wonder what you thought about that.
I think it's quite reasonable. You look at housing and the lack of housing, homelessness, and the link between good housing and health outcomes is obvious. So I think it's quite reasonable to talk about a Hippocratic oath. If you're leaving people without sound accommodation, and by demolishing masses of social homes like we've seen over the last couple of decades in Glasgow, the skyline totally changed. And you're also not maintaining your stock, and it's a mouldy disaster. How can people have good health and well-being? But even if it's not like a physical problem with the home, how could you have good mental health when you're a person that can't find a home? If you're transient, if you're sleeping on sofas, if you're in a seriously overcrowded situation, it's just devastating to communities. And if there's massive social clearances like we're seeing in areas like the Wynford, it's so damaging to the fabric of society. How can you maintain communities? If I'm a vulnerable person, or even if I'm not especially vulnerable, let's say I'm a single person with no family nearby, which isn't my case, the Wynford is my community. These people are my family, they're my friends, people bring me things when I'm sick if I can't get to the shops, How's my well-being decent? I've got neighbours who are single parents, you rely on the community to help you out. It's just, it's so damaging to the fabric of society and to communities to be demolishing masses of homes and just ripping communities apart.
And of course, that brings us on to something you were talking about earlier, Fiona, about dampness and mould.
Yeah.
And in England, they're bringing in the AWAB's law. The child died AWAB because of the dampness. Michael Gove, I dare say we're probably not going to mention too many things in a positive light on this channel by Michael Gove, but he's bringing in a law that will allow tenants in England to challenge their housing association or social landlord if they fail to address dampness. But that law isn't being mirrored in Scotland. So there'll be a range of statutory obligations on landlords and heavy penalties if they fail to meet them. But in Scotland, what's happening instead is a system of self-regulation, essentially lobbied for by the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, which it's fair to say the Wheatley Group looms large within. And the Scottish Housing Regulator has accepted this system of self-regulation. Now, I'm sure in your casework you'll see many cases where self-regulation has failed.
Yeah.
But apparently this will match AWAB's law without any statutory obligation to provide damp-free homes. And then, of course, you have at the same time very recent news that in its 93,000 properties, Wheatley Homes claim that they have never had a complaint about dampness, and they receive no. They own no information on dampness in any of their properties.
Oh, I've got some emails that would surprise you then, and I'd be very happy to.
Yeah, it would be good if you could elaborate
some numbers on that. I've had a number of constituents who are Wheatley who have told me about mould in their homes, dampness in their homes, and I know that my colleagues have as well. So I'm very shocked that they would say that.
Well, of course, the thing is we have the self-regulation.
Yes. And
the regulator will only take the information from the landlord, and if the landlord says we don't have any data or any complaints about dampness, then that's the situation according to the Scottish Housing Regulator. Whereas in England, we're bringing in this statutory obligation to meet certain standards.
Right. Well, I think that self-regulation of any public service is completely unacceptable. and social housing is a public service and it's subsidised by the public. It exists in the first place to replace council houses. It is a fundamental service to the public. So I just think self-regulation is totally unacceptable.
Yeah.
It should be held accountable. There should be an inspectorate even for social housing. I think that we should have that. Why don't we have that?
Well, it's fair to say I don't know of any fines that have taken place for social landlords who fail to meet regulations, whether that be the energy efficiency standards for social housing, or even just the requirement that all houses are wind and watertight.
Right.
But self-regulation seems to be very much in vogue in Scotland and with the government.
Yeah.
And obviously the Scottish Tenants Organisation has taken up several cases, just like yourself, Fiona, about tenants in mouldy conditions. What's your view, Cam?
Yeah, I mean it's completely unnecessary, isn't it? That anyone would be, live like that, in this day and age. I mean, I kind of repeating myself a little bit here, but the technology exists to go into old buildings. I mean, we're developing it in Glasgow as well on Nidri Road. To go into old buildings and to do these kind of incredible retrofits on even the most kind of rundown buildings, and to do them up, to turn them, to transform them into really comfortable and safe places for people to live. I mean, another kind of point that I think is quite important, although it might seem a bit of a kind of branch off, but Malcolm Fraser is one of our supporters, and he talks a lot about the amount of toxins that are in a lot of building materials. So it's not just mold; it's actually in paint. It's in a lot of obviously think of asbestos as like a problem in the past, but there's still asbestos, and lots of materials that have literally have toxic material in them, and these are kind of normal materials that are used in the environments that we live in. So I think there's a very deep problem there in terms of recognising what is low quality and what's high quality, and high quality is without mold, without damp, without cold. It's even like things like there's it's having like temperature distributed evenly throughout the house so that you're just always comfortable as well, and there's not hot patches and cold patches, and there's not heat escaping out cold bridges, and there's so many aspects to this that is
many things that the Scottish Tenants Organisation is taking up in Woodside and Westler Common, Halton Hill.
Yeah. But I think there just needs to be a much deeper commitment to. I guess I think we need to start thinking about like the housing the same way that we do about the NHS, about seeing it as this absolutely essential unconditional housing. Everyone should have a house. It should be and it should be it's obviously is being underfunded, but I think most people agree that it should be funded properly. And similarly, I think we need a retrofit strategy in Scotland that is as ambitious as the NHS was when it was set up. So I think and it needs to be seen in terms of public health as well.
Well, perhaps on that, I wonder if you maybe want to have some closing remarks, because we've covered a lot of ground tonight. First off, the eviction ban and the failures of that, and we've got the rents. Some landlords being defeated by the tenants, others pursuing the highest rent rises in the country. Homelessness and all the problems associated with that. Cuts to the housing budget. The GHA itself targeting tenants, and then all the kind of housing and policy questions that we've covered. But mould featured a lot in our discussions tonight. I wonder if you maybe want to comment on that, Fiona.
Yeah, I think when it comes to pretty much everything that you've referred to there, the massive mess that we find ourselves in, I would say the only answer is to build more, which would make up for the way you've demolished loads of social houses, and then you demolish some social houses, and then you demolish some social houses. So we need them back. And then look at our housing stock. It's not in good condition. Not wholesale, some of it is in good condition, but actually quite a bit isn't. And all the while, stock we have will be getting worse and worse and catching up to the ones that are not in good condition now. We're making an unmanageable situation. And I think that's what lots of social landlords are in now. They've got masses of properties that need to be repaired and upgraded, and it's become financially unmanageable because it's just mushroomed. I would really like to see a social housing inspectorate and social housing auditing. I was a teacher for 7 years. We have the education inspectorate, and that accountability is necessary. Marking your own homework is not acceptable.
No.
And that's what the Scottish Government does, and sometimes what councils do as well. And it's never best practice. You're never going to... I taught morals for years, and one of the main pieces of advice I would pass on to my pupils in decision making would be a bit of advice I got from my dad, and he said the mark of a person is what they'll do when they think no one's looking.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what we're dealing with social landlords, and that's what we're dealing with the Scottish Government. And I don't think the Scottish Government are necessarily trying to make life easy for social landlords. Maybe there's some of that, but I think primarily they can't be bothered with the accountability process and really taking responsibility there. So build more social houses, look after the stock you've got. I would like to see a social housing inspectorate. I would also like to see a service set up specifically for tenants, both social and private, so that they can really be represented by specialists who will hold landlords, social or private, to account.
What about you, Carnen? What's your reflections?
Yeah, I have to agree with
Yeah.
pretty much everything you've said. Yeah, I mean, we need more social housing. I think, I'm very, I won't pretend I don't have a very strong position about the demolition of these kind of flats. I don't think they should be demolished, but that doesn't mean that, I don't believe in new builds as well, because actually I think there's just the problem. What I think is so disgusting about what's happening is that what is being built is not replacing what is being lost, and I think. Well,
indeed, 66,000 public homes demolished since the advent of the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah. I mean, it's. I don't understand why it's not more of a scandal. To be honest, it feels like it's just not broken yet, or it's not quite. But anyway, I don't know if people are kind of really making the links. But I mean, I think, to kind of sum up, I guess, I kind of said this earlier, that Wheatley likes to characterise people who are kind of campaigning for these flats as these kind of mad activists, which I think is very insulting, actually, because the basic principles that we are trying to uphold are actually very, very basic. It's about affordable housing, genuinely secure housing. It's about exposing what's going wrong. It's about proper consultation and participation in the community, so that they feel engaged by these processes and not alienated by them, and excited as well by the prospect of what investment could actually do when in existing communities. I mean, I think I think we misappropriated the word investment to mean kind of I don't destruction in many cases, and it's actually investment needs to go into the heart of our communities that already exist, instead of funding a lot of breaking up basically places.
Demolition is expensive business.
Demolition is very expensive, and it's just mad as well. I mean, to think there's rent increases from housing association tenants or social tenants are getting these big rent hikes, and then there's £250 million being spent regenerating big parts of the city, huge demolitions of buildings like the Buchanan Galleries, which is it's younger than I am. It's like, it just feels like it's a bit of a joke, really, a lot of this stuff, and there just seems to be a massive disconnect between this kind of principle that people should have good places to live, that I think most people agree with, versus this kind of idea that we should be spending millions of pounds, hundreds of millions of pounds on things that are not meaningfully going to impact people's lives. It's so That's my piece.
Well, thanks again, folks, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Talk to you again soon.
Thank you.